In the cold winter of 1958, a murder spree occurred in Nebraska. 10 people were killed over the course of a few days. There was also another murder 2 months earlier. What might be most shocking about this case is that the cold-hearted killers were teenagers. Charles Starkweather was 19 and Caril Fugate was 14. While most labeled the duo a Bonnie and Clyde love story, Caril claims she was held hostage by Charles. To this day, 65 years later, people still debate whether Caril Fugate was a victim or a diabolical teenage killer. Hi everyone, my name's Anne, but I also go by my nickname Mimi. I like to focus on Midwest true crime because I'm a Minnesota farmer's daughter. Today we're going to go to Nebraska and talk about Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate. This case was requested by Frisco Shan, so thank you very much for the suggestion. This murder spree occurred in 1958, but there's still so much debate today about what Caril Fugate's involvement in it was. Was she held hostage by Charles? Some call her the 12th victim. Or was she a willing participant? Regardless, these two changed the state of Nebraska forever. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born on November 24, 1938 in Lincoln, Nebraska. Lincoln in the 1950s had a population of around 100,000. It was a typical big city in the Midwest, surrounded by farms and fields. Lincoln had a very low crime rate at the time. People left their doors unlocked. Very few police were needed to patrol the streets at night. Charlie was one of 7 children born to Guy and Helen Starkweather. They were a working-class family but weren't in desperate need. The children had adequate clothes and never went hungry. Guy worked as a carpenter but suffered from rheumatoid arthritis that made it difficult for him to work. To help pay bills, Helen worked as a waitress. Charlie had a good home life. He loved to play with his brothers. It seems like his parents treated him very well. But life changed after he started school because he was bullied. Charlie had red hair, a speech impediment, and was considered a slow learner. He had been born with genu varum, which is commonly known as bow-legged. All of this caused kids to pick on him. The bullying built up a lot of rage in Charlie. He also became jealous of kids who came from families who were better off. Charlie excelled in PE class because it gave him a physical outlet for his rage. But eventually, Charlie found more enjoyment in taking his rage out on the kids who bullied him. And then he just started being a little dipshit to everybody. Charlie would grow to be only 5'5", but he was stocky and strong, and he was not afraid to pick on somebody who was bigger than him. Kids began to fear him. Charlie would pass people on the street, random strangers, and he would shout at them to go to hell. He had violent outbursts at home too that made his family scared of him. Charlie idolized James Dean and loved that bad boy rebel persona. A classmate said of Charlie, quote, "He could be the kindest person you've ever seen. He'd do anything for you if he liked you. He was a hell of a lot of fun to be around too. Everything was just one big joke to him. But he had this other side. He could be mean as hell, cruel. If he saw some poor guy on the street who was bigger than he was, better looking or better dressed, he'd try to take the poor bastard down to his size." Unquote. Charlie dropped out of school his senior year and got a job as a garbage man. He was often in the wealthier neighborhoods of Lincoln, and this fueled his class envy because he saw people living in big homes, driving nice cars, and he was picking up their trash. Eventually, Guy kicked Charlie out of the house due to his behavior. Charlie became very pessimistic, and he felt the need to have power over others. He told friends, quote, "Dead people are all on the same level," unquote. In 1956, when Charlie was 18, he met 13-year-old Caril Fugate. His friend Bob was dating Caril's older sister Barbara. Charlie and Caril became smitten with each other and started dating. This was Caril's first boyfriend, and she was drawn to his bad boy image. Charlie had never had a serious girlfriend and enjoyed having a younger girl interested in him. Flash forward to about 2 years later when they got arrested, and they felt very differently about each other. They told different stories on how the crimes occurred. Charlie said Caril was a willing participant who committed some of the murders herself. Caril said Charlie held her hostage as he went on his killing spree. She said he threatened to kill her family if she didn't cooperate. I think there's a lot about this case that we're just never going to know the truth of how things actually occurred. Caril Ann Fugate was born on July 30th, 1943 to William and Velda Fugate. Her parents divorced and Velda married a man named Marion Bartlett. They had a daughter together, Betty Jean. Charlie got a job at a newspaper warehouse near Caril's school so they could see each other more. Every day after school, they would hang out. It's understandable Carol's mom and stepdad were not happy about the relationship because Charlie was older with a bad reputation. Charlie committed his first murder a couple months before his killing spree. Around 3 a.m. on December 1st, 1957, Charlie entered the Crest service station on Cornhusker Highway. 21-year-old Robert Culver was a service attendant working that night. He had recently returned to his home state from the Navy. He was married and they were expecting a baby. That night, Charlie wanted to buy a stuffed animal for Caril, but didn't have enough cash. He asked Robert if he could buy it on credit, and Robert said no. So Charlie bought a pack of cigarettes. He returned 10 minutes later and bought gum. He came back 10 minutes later, put on a hunting cap to hide his red hair and a bandana over his face. He walked into the Crest station carrying his shotgun and a bag. He forced Robert to fill the bag with cash from the register, and he ended up with about $150. He ordered Robert at gunpoint to get in his car. He drove northeast on Cornhusker Highway to 27th Street and turned onto Superior, which was a dirt road back then. He ordered Robert to get out of his car. Robert tried to fight back, but Charlie shot him in the back of his head. Charlie drove away, leaving Robert's body lying on the road. He threw his shotgun in the river. A couple hours later, Robert's body was discovered. Police suspected a transient had done it, and the murder was unsolved until Charlie was arrested for his killing spree. January 1958 was a rough month for Charlie. He got fired from his job as a garbage man. He was kicked out of his apartment because he couldn't pay the rent. He slept in his car. His parents told him they were worried he was spending too much time with Caril. Caril's parents, meanwhile, were worried that she was going to end up pregnant. They told her she couldn't see Charlie anymore. According to Caril, she and Charlie had started to argue with each other a lot. He even dragged her off a school bus one time in front of people. Caril said she started to hide in the bathroom at school after school was over to avoid Charlie. The killing spree began on Tuesday, January 21st, 1958. Charlie borrowed his brother's rifle, telling him that he was going to go hunting. He then drove to the Bartlett home at 924 Belmont. 58-year-old Marion and 36-year-old Velda were home with 2-year-old Betty Jean. Charlie and Velda argued over Caril. She told him to never come back. Charlie left but returned 15 minutes later. This time Marion kicked him out. Literally. Like he literally kicked him in the bum and was like, "Get out." Charlie drove to a grocery store. He called Marion's work and told them Marion was sick and would not be in for a few days. Around 3 p.m., Charlie went back to the Bartlett home and argued with Velda and Marion again. Charlie ran into Caril's room to load his rifle. Marion ran in there with a hammer, and Charlie shot him in the head. Velda started to come at him with a knife, and Charlie shot her in the face. 2-year-old Betty Jean started crying, and Charlie struck her with his rifle. He then stabbed her several times in her throat. Charlie wrapped Velda's body in a blanket, drug her to the backyard, and shoved her in the opening in the outhouse. He wrapped Betty Jean's body in a blanket and put her in a box that he set on top of the outhouse toilet. He dragged Marion's body to the chicken coop and left it there. In Charlie's version, Caril was home this whole time, watching TV as he killed her family. He claims she once told him that she wanted to blow her mother's brains out. In Caril's version, she had broken up with Charlie after he got too possessive, and then he went to her house that day to try to get her back. She claimed after she got home from school that day, Charlie was hiding behind the door. He told her that her family was being held hostage by a woman at another location, and if she didn't cooperate with him, they would be killed. But she didn't know they were already dead in the backyard. One thing for sure is that Caril and Charlie didn't immediately leave the Bartlett home after the murders. They hung out there for 6 days. To keep people away, Caril put a note on the front door that said everyone had the flu. She signed it Miss Bartlett, which she later said was her way of letting people know something was wrong. Because her older sister Barbara was married, Caril was Miss Fugate, her mother was Mrs. Bartlett, so the only Miss Bartlett in the house was her 2-year-old half-sister, who obviously couldn't write. Over the next few days, people tried to stop by the home, but Caril turned them away. On January 25th, Barbara and her husband stopped by with their new baby. Caril yelled at them from the front door to stay away, otherwise Mom would get hurt. That night, Barbara's husband and Charlie's brother were turned away at the door, so they called police. Around 10 p.m., police officers went to the home, but Caril assured them everything was fine, and they left. Charlie's version is that he was sleeping when the police arrived, and Caril woke him up to ask him what should she tell the police to get them to go away. If that was true, Caril obviously wasn't being held hostage because if Charlie was sleeping, she could have easily told the police she needed help. On Monday morning, Carol's grandmother stopped by and Carol refused to let her in, so she told Carol she was going to call the police. After she left, Charlie and Carol left the Bartlett home and walked to Charlie's dad's house. They got into his 1949 Ford and drove away. When police arrived at the Bartlett home, they didn't find anybody inside, and they didn't see any other signs that anything was wrong because they didn't check the backyard. The next day, family went to the house and found the bodies. Police immediately suspected Charlie. Since Carol's body wasn't found, they assumed she was with Charlie. It doesn't sound like their first thought was, oh my god, he kidnapped her, but instead was, oh my god, they're teen lovers and killed her family so they could run off together. The Bartlett murders made the nightly news and shocked the town. At the time, Lincoln averaged 1 murder a year. Here were 3 murders at one time. A search began for the teens. A reporter found a picture of Charlie and Carol in the house where they are sitting in the Bartlett living room. This was printed in the paper the next morning. After they left the Bartlett home, Charlie and Carol stopped at a service station around noon. Carol claimed Charlie went in to use the bathroom, and while she waited in the car, she scribbled on a note, "Help, police, don't ignore," and she put the note in her pocket so that when she had the opportunity to give it to somebody without Charlie noticing, she could. She never ended up giving this note to anybody. About an hour later, they stopped at another service station to fix a tire. While Charlie did that, Carol went into a nearby cafe and ordered hamburgers for themselves. The counter girl claimed that the entire time Carol was waiting for her food, she stared at her. The two then drove southeast out of Lincoln. Carol claimed that Charlie kept threatening her if she didn't cooperate, he could make one phone call and have her family killed. A little before 2 p.m., Charlie and Carol drove to a farm that belonged to 70-year-old August Meyer near Bennett, Nebraska. August was a friend of the Starkweathers. Charlie and his dad often hunted with him. They started up his driveway, but the car got stuck in the mud. They walked to a nearby abandoned storm cellar that had once been under a schoolhouse to try to stay warm. But then they decided to walk up to August's house. August greeted them, and Charlie told them the car was stuck in the mud. August wasn't alarmed to see Charlie standing there with a shotgun since they had hunted together so often. August offered to get his horses to pull the car out. August put on his coat and started walking towards the barn while the teens followed behind him. Charlie then shot August in the back of his head. He dragged his body into the wash house. This a-hole then shot August's dog because it was barking. The teens went through the house looking for cash, bullets, anything they could use. They stopped in the kitchen and ate cookies and Jell-O. According to Carol, this was the first time she saw Charlie kill anybody, so this really put a lot of fear in her. So she's like, well, if I don't cooperate, what's he going to do to me? Around 5:30 that evening, Charlie and Carol tried to push the car out of the mud. A farmer passing by helped them get it loose, and they drove up to August's house. But Charlie felt like someone had been in the house since they left, so they drove away. And just 10 minutes later, Charlie felt he overreacted, so they drove back to August's farm. And get this, he got stuck in the mud in the driveway again. They decided to walk down the road. Around 7:30 p.m., a car with 2 teenagers drove by and offered them a ride. This was 17-year-old Robert Jensen and his 16-year-old girlfriend, Caril King. Charlie and Caril Fugate got in the back seat. Charlie pointed his gun against the back of Robert's head and ordered him to drive to a nearby storm cellar. Charlie made them get out. As Robert stood at the top of the stairs, Charlie shot him 6 times in the back of his head. Robert's body fell to the bottom of the stairs. Charlie removed some of Caril King's clothes. Some reports say he raped her, some say he attempted to rape her but was unable to. He then shot her in the head, killing her. He then stabbed her in her privates. He threw her body on top of Robert's. A nearby farmer named Everett Browning thought he heard shots around this time, but brushed it off. Charlie later claimed that Caril Fugate pointed a gun at Caril King, and she stole cash from Robert. Caril claimed she never got out of the car while all of this went down. The teens left in Robert's car and drove off into the night. When the sun came up the next morning, police were still searching for the teens. Around noon, an officer noticed Charlie's car stuck in the mud in August Meyer's driveway. He called for other officers, and soon the farm was surrounded. Police thought Charlie and Carol were hiding in August's house. They used a bullhorn and yelled at them to come out. They brought in tear gas to try to smoke them out, but when they did enter the buildings, all they found was August Meyer's body in the wash house. When Robert Jensen and Caril King hadn't come home, their parents got worried. They filed a missing persons report around 3 a.m. Farmer Everett Broning was at August Meyer's house watching all of this commotion go on, and he was like, I think I heard a gunshot last night. So he decided to check out the storm cellar. And there, when he peeked in, he saw Robert Jensen and Caril King's bodies laying at the bottom of the ladder. Police were sure Charlie and Caril were behind all the murders. The hardware store in Bennett quickly sold out of all its ammunition, guns, and knives. 100 troopers came to the area from Omaha, Columbus, Grand Island, and Fremont to help find the teen killers. Charlie had started driving west, planning to head to Washington State because that was where one of his brothers lived. But he was trying to be smarter than police, and he was thinking that the police probably assumed he was going to leave the state. So when they reached Hastings, Nebraska around 1 a.m., he turned around and headed back to Lincoln. Around 3 a.m., they drove to a wealthy section of Lincoln, an area Charlie was familiar with from when he worked as a garbage man. They parked the car in an alley and slept in the car. When they woke up the next morning, January 28th, they knew police were looking for Robert Jensen's car, so they had to find a new vehicle. They drove around and decided to pull into the driveway of a home on South 24th Street that belonged to 47-year-old Chester Ward and his 50-year-old wife, Clara. Chester was a prominent businessman and chairman of the Capitol Steel Works. He was at the office that morning. Charlie and Caril went to the back, and Charlie banged on the kitchen windows with his rifle. The Ward's maid, 51-year-old Ludmilla Fensel, who also went by Lillian, opened the door. Charlie pointed the rifle at her and asked if anyone else was home. Ludmilla didn't respond because she was deaf. When Charlie realized this, he found a piece of paper and scribbled on it, "Sit down and shut up." Clara then entered the kitchen. Charlie ordered her to sit at the table. They held the two ladies hostage for several hours. Around 1 p.m., Clara asked if she could go upstairs and change her shoes, and Charlie let her. After several minutes, he went up to her bedroom to check on her. He found Clara holding a .22 pistol. She fired a shot at him but missed. He threw a knife at her and hit her back. Clara tried to crawl to the phone. Charlie tried to get to her, but the Ward's dog tried to protect her, and he wouldn't let Charlie get close to Clara. So Charlie used the butt of his rifle to break the dog's neck. Poor little guy, he went out a hero trying to save his mama. Charlie tied Clara to the bed and stabbed her multiple times in her chest and neck. Charlie claimed Caril was holding a gun on Ludmilla the whole time he was killing Clara. The afternoon paper arrived, and it had an article about Charlie and Caril. Caril cut out the picture of she and Charlie and the photos of her family. This really hurt her later on because she claimed she didn't know her family was dead until after they got arrested. But they found that photo on her where it talked about her family being dead. That evening, Chester Ward was visiting his friend Victor Anderson, who happened to be the governor of Nebraska. They sat in the governor's office and, like most people in Lincoln at that time, talked about the murders. Around 5:30 p.m., Chester left and headed home. When he entered through the back door, Charlie greeted him with the gun. They fought, and Charlie threw Chester down the basement stairs. Chester ran back up and started to run towards the front door, but Charlie shot him in his back and head, killing him. The murder of Ludmilla has the most conflicting stories. She was found tied to her bed, dead from stab wounds to her chest and stomach. Charlie claimed he didn't know the maid was dead until after he was arrested. Caril claimed she didn't kill anybody. So who killed the maid? We will never know. Charlie dyed his red hair black using shoe polish. They went through the house and grabbed jewelry and any other items they found valuable, then got into the Ward's 1956 Packard. They headed west out of Lincoln on Highway 34, planning again to make their way to Washington. Charlie fell asleep at the wheel and drove into a ditch. They were fine and the car was fine, but they decided to sleep for a couple hours. They then continued driving. Around 9 a.m., they crossed the border into Wyoming on Highway 20. When Chester didn't show up for work the next morning, January 29th, a coworker went to the Ward house around noon and discovered the bodies. Now people really panicked. The murders kept occurring and all the victims were of random types. Poor, rich, young, old. No one knew who would be the next killed. Businesses closed so people could go home. Schools closed and sent children home. Men carried shotguns as they walked around. Within 2 hours of the Ward's bodies being found, all the hardware stores in Lincoln sold out of ammunition, knives, bows, etc. People stayed up all night, too afraid to fall asleep. The governor called up 200 National Guard members to patrol Lincoln in jeeps with machine guns. The FBI got involved. The sheriff called for armed men to meet him and form a posse, and over 100 men showed up. A helicopter searched from the air for the ward's car. Everyone wanted to find the teens before they killed again.
Well, since discovering the last 3 bodies, which makes a total of 9 that we know of so far, Mayor Martin and I have made an appeal for all adjoining counties, including Omaha, to send all available help they can to Lincoln. We want to cover Lincoln block to block.
Roadblocks were put up on every road out of Lincoln, but Charlie and Caril were already gone. As Charlie and Caril drove through Wyoming, they heard on the radio that police were looking for the ward's Packard, so they wanted to get a different vehicle. Around 1 p.m., about 15 miles west of Douglas, Wyoming, on Highway 87, Charlie noticed a Buick parked on the side of the road. Inside, 34-year-old Merle Collison was sleeping. He was a traveling shoe salesman and had pulled over to get some rest. Back home in Great Falls, Montana, Merle had a wife and 6-month-old baby. Charlie parked and walked to the driver's window. He knocked and woke up Merle. Charlie told him to unlock the door because they were going to trade cars. Merle refused, so Charlie went back to the Packard, grabbed his rifle, then went back to the driver's door. He fired 2 shots through the window, striking Merle. Charlie opened the door and fired 7 more shots into Merle's body. He pushed Merle's body to the floor of the car and yelled for Caril to get in the back seat. Charlie later claimed that his gun jammed, so Caril fired the fatal shot. He said she was the most trigger-happy person he had ever met. Charlie tried to drive away in Merle's car, but he couldn't figure out how to get the emergency brake off. 29-year-old Joe Sprinkle drove by and saw the 2 cars parked on the side of the road, but didn't think anyone was in them, so he drove past. But then he saw in his rearview mirror Charlie get out of a car, so he turned around and went back to see if they needed help. Joe got out of his car and walked towards Charlie. When Charlie turned around, Joe saw he was holding a rifle. Charlie ordered Joe to release the emergency brake. Joe then noticed Caril crying in the back seat. He then saw Merle's body on the floor of the car. Joe was a big guy. He lunged at Charlie and they began a wild fight to try to get control of the gun. It was very lucky timing that Sheriff Deputy William Romer just happened to drive by at this time. He saw the fight and pulled over. Caril burst out of the car and ran towards the sheriff deputy, screaming something like, "Save me, it's Charlie Starkweather, he's going to kill me," or something like that. She climbed into the back of his patrol car. Charlie jumped into the Packard and sped off towards Douglas. Sheriff Deputy Romer radioed for help. Chief of Police Robert Ainsley and Sheriff Earl Heflin heard the call and caught up to Charlie about 6 miles west of Douglas.
About 1:55, received a radio message from Casper. They said that this party was headed this direction, so I immediately come up, got the sheriff. Him and I proceeded west.
Did you have any idea who it was at that time?
Yes, they had told us who it was.
I see.
And that he was armed.
They chased him into town, and the 2 cars reached speeds of 100 miles per hour through downtown Douglas. Robert Ainsley was driving, and Sheriff Heflin stuck his head out the window and fired shots towards Charlie's tires. People on the street screamed and ran for cover as the cars sped past, bullets firing everywhere. It was like straight out of a movie. Charlie made his way through Douglas and back on the open road, the police car close behind him. Sheriff Heflin shot the rear windshield and shattered the glass. Charlie slammed on the brakes. The police stopped their car about 100 feet away. Charlie got out of the car and he had blood all over his shirt. When the windshield shattered, glass had hit the back of his ear. Robert Ainsley yelled at him to put his hands up, but Charlie refused. So Robert fired a shot towards Charlie's feet. He yelled again for Charlie to put his hands up.
He just stood there and glared at us, so we dropped another shot at his feet. He then laid down, put his hands behind his back.
He was handcuffed and brought to the Douglas jail. Charlie apparently told them to not be rough on the girl because she had nothing to do with it. Sheriff Heflin later said, quote, "He thought he was bleeding to death. That's why he stopped. That's the kind of yellow son of a bitch he is," unquote.
In the cattle town of Douglas, Wyoming, end of the trail for a smart aleck gunman. The trail of 11 killings from Lincoln, Nebraska into Wyoming. A 3-day spree until Charles Starkweather, 19, landed behind prison bars.
Sheriff Romer drove to the jail with Caril. During the drive, Caril told him she had witnessed 9 of the murders. She told him some details that were later verified as true. This is probably what damaged her the most in her trial because she had claimed that she wasn't home when her family was killed, and she claimed she had been in the car when Robert Jensen and Carole King were killed, but she knew specifics of how they were killed. 11 people had been killed. 10 were killed over the course of 8 days. At the time of their arrest, Charlie was just 19 and Caril was just 14. They were held overnight in the Douglas jail. Charlie pretty quickly confessed to the murders, but he claimed they were self-defense. Even killing 2-year-old Betty Jean, he said was self-defense. The media were allowed to be right outside Charlie's jail cell and take pictures and videos of him. Charlie wrote a letter to his dad saying the cops were treating him nice, but the reporters were annoying. He wrote that he wanted to throw water in their faces. He also wrote, quote, "Dad, I'm not real sorry for what I did because for the first time, me and Caril have more fun," unquote. Caril said she was sitting in a jail cell when a man told her that her family had been murdered.
And they said, my God, girl, your family's dead. See, it was at that point that nothing meant really anything, because I had felt that, that I had failed to save him. I had how many days that I had spent with this man, and thought what I was doing was saving him. And then to find out later, they were already dead,
She went into shock and refused to say anything. They sedated her and she fell asleep. There was some discussion on where they should be held because they had committed murders in Nebraska and Wyoming, but ultimately it was decided to send them back to Nebraska because Nebraska had a death penalty and Wyoming did not. During the car ride to Nebraska, Charlie confessed to killing Robert Colvert in December. On the route back to Nebraska, they spent a night at a jail in Gering. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Charlie took a pencil and wrote on the jail cell wall, "Caril is the one who said to go to Washington State. By the time anybody will read this, I will be dead for all the killings. Then they cannot give Caril the chair too. From Lincoln, Nebraska, they got us. January 29, 1958. Kill 11 persons. Charles kill 9, all men. Caril kill 1, all girls. They have so many cops and people watching us leave, I can't add all of them up." At the bottom, he put he and Caril's names and surrounded them with a heart. When they arrived in Lincoln, they were greeted with a frenzy of media because the murders had captivated the town, so everybody wanted to see who had been the people behind the murders. Charlie was brought to the Nebraska State Penitentiary and Caril was sent to a women's reformatory due to her young age. The whole time, Caril kept claiming she was innocent and had been a hostage. Charlie had initially said Caril was innocent, but now was saying she was a willing participant. He wrote 2 letters to the prosecutor in which he said Caril Fugate killed Carol King. He wrote, quote, "I'll be convicted for what I did, and that's okay, but I'll be damned if I'll be sentenced for what I didn't do," unquote. Most of the public considered Caril just as evil as Charlie. They looked at the two as a Bonnie and Clyde of the Midwest. Charlie and Caril were only charged with the first-degree murder of Robert Jensen. The only reason I could find for this said that it was due to technical reasons. I wonder if it was a cost issue, because with just one first-degree murder conviction, you're either going away for life or getting the death penalty. While he sat in jail waiting for his trial to start, Charlie did some sketches and they were actually really good. He also started writing an autobiography and said that his rebellion against the world started on his first day of school because that was when he got picked on and laughed at. He said anger built up in him and made him hate everyone except his family. Charlie's trial started on May 5th, 1958. He still claimed shooting Robert Jensen had been self-defense, which was really hard to believe because he had been shot 6 times in the back of his head. Caril's lawyers didn't allow her to testify and said they would invoke the Fifth Amendment if she was called. Charlie's defense talked about his mental health and claimed he had a head injury. None of it worked. On May 22nd, Charlie was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Robert Jensen. He was sentenced to death. Caril wrote a letter to President Eisenhower pleading that he not be executed because she thought maybe one day he would tell the truth and tell everyone she was innocent. Charlie was scheduled to be executed on June 25th, 1959. That night, a radio station played songs about death, and dozens of teenagers drove nearby the penitentiary, cranking the radio as loud as they could. And oh my gosh, at 10 p.m., just a couple hours before the execution, the doctor who was in the prison to sign the death certificate after Charlie was executed had a heart attack and died while he was in the warden's office. But the execution still went on.
Charles Starkweather walked into this execution chamber at midnight. He did not display one shred of fear or remorse. Starkweather was strapped into the electric chair. Prison officials asked him if there was anything he wanted to say. He shook his head and remained silent. Then they drew this curtain. In a few moments, it was all over.
He was buried in the Wyoming Cemetery in Lincoln, where 5 of his victims are also buried. Caril had a maiden assigned to her to escort her places. In July 1958, it was decided she would be tried as an adult. 2 days before her trial began, she gave an interview with journalist Nanette Beaver. The public's image of Caril was of this cold-hearted killer. The goal of the interview was to show the public, hey, she's just a 15-year-old girl. But it didn't work because Caril came across as very blunt. She didn't show any emotion.
Why do you think he would even implicate you in that if you didn't have anything at all to do with it? Why do you think he'd want to implicate you?
Well, by now I'm sure he hates me for running away. He's trying to make it look like I'm just guilty and feeling.
Had you gone with him for quite a while?
Yes, I'd went with him a year before, and then I told him I didn't want to see him again, but he came back. And after that Sunday, I went with him, and then I kept telling him to leave. And that Sunday, I told him to leave, and I told him I didn't ever want to see him again.
What had brought you to this conclusion? Why didn't you want to go with him anymore?
I think he's crazy.
Have you thought that if you were convicted, that you might go to prison, or you might even go to the electric chair? Have you thought much about that?
Yes, I have, and I don't really believe that I have anything to worry about that, because the Lord knows that I'm innocent, and I know it. The people who are involved in it knows it.
Did you ever break down and cry and beg Charlie to let you go or anything like that?
Yes, I cried all the way.
At that time, I thought she was the most defiant person I'd ever seen. Just her attitude and things. I don't think that she would have stopped right then if she could have got away. I think she wasn't bothered. I didn't see any remorse or any such thing like that.
When they asked me to do the interview, I had no idea that I was going to walk into a smoke-filled room packed with people, and the attitude that I displayed, which some consider a wise-ass attitude, was the fact that I was barely hanging on a thread. My constant thought through this whole thing was, please, dear God, don't let me lose my mind.
Caril had been living in a reformatory in York in solitary confinement for several months at the time of the interview, so it's possible that caused her to have a hardened effect. The only people who seemed to support Caril were her sister Barbara and other family members. Caril's trial started in October 1958. People still didn't believe she was a hostage. They felt she had a lot of opportunities to escape, and she didn't take those opportunities. Sheriff Deputy Romer testified about how Caril told him she had witnessed 9 of the murders, and she was able to describe them.
You could see that the killings hadn't bothered her any. There didn't seem to be any remorse in her at all about the fact that her mother and stepsister were dead.
On November 5th and 6th, Charlie was let off death row to testify against Caril. He talked about how she was a willing participant, and he said which parts of the crimes she committed. He said he didn't care if Caril lived or died. Caril testified on November 14th, 17th, and 18th. The sides rested on November 19th. On November 21st, Caril Fugate was found guilty of first-degree murder while in perpetration of robbery, because it was believed she had stolen cash from Robert Jensen. She was sentenced to life in prison and spared the death penalty because she was so young. She was just 15 years old and was the youngest female to ever be convicted of first-degree murder. She was sent back to the women's reformatory since she was too young for prison. Caril might not have received a fair trial because public opinion swayed heavily towards her guilt. One of the jurors, H.A. Walenta, made a comment to a friend, quote, "I bet you $1 she gets the chair," unquote. But he had been honest about that in court during jury selection.
Both attorneys had asked me if I'd formed an opinion. I said I thought she'd ought to sit in Charlie's lap and save the double expense. But then they ask you if facts were given to you to prove you're wrong, if you could change your mind. You'd be an idiot if somebody asked and proved you wrong and you wouldn't admit it.
Caril's lawyer filed a motion for a mistrial, but the judge denied it, stating there was no prejudicial error. Her lawyer also filed a motion for a new trial, but that was also denied. Caril settled into life at the reformatory. Caril said she would stare out the window, and every time a car pulled up, she hoped it was someone realizing they made a mistake and were coming to get her. She got school lessons for 45 minutes 3 times a week. It was a strict environment. They were not allowed to talk outside of recreation time. They were not allowed to lay on their beds unless it was nighttime. If they were sick during the day, they had to lay on the concrete floor. They had to do chores and sometimes were only fed tea and toast. Because Caril was such a well-known inmate, this brought a lot of attention to the conditions in the reformatory, and the warden resigned. A new warden took over and changes were made. The rules were still strict because, after all, these women were still there for a reason, but the environment was more relaxed. They could listen to the radio and watch TV, wear their own clothes and not a uniform. They were offered typing classes and other trade courses. They wanted the women to gain self-worth so they could become useful citizens. If you met certain requirements, you were allowed to go into town under supervision. Caril went out and she became a regular at the bowling alley. She went to the movies and shopped. The town let the women use the swimming pool, so Caril got to go swimming. So it's not like life in the reformatory was super bad. I mean, how many prisoners can say they bowl and go swimming? York established a work release program with the reformatory so women could work in local businesses. Caril worked in a church daycare. One woman whose child went to the daycare didn't know who she was at first, but when she found out it was the Caril Fugate, she decided it wasn't a deal breaker.
You know, we all need a chance to prove ourselves. And I could put myself in her place very easily and say, well, my life would really be over if no one would trust me again.
It really sounds like the people of York wanted to help the women get back on their feet and become functioning members of society.
And in the Bible it says that we should reach out a helping hand to those who need it. And I truly believe that those out at the Women's Reformatory do need our help, not just Caril, but she has become a personal friend of mine. When she comes up before the parole board, I really do plan on bringing a carload of the people in our church that will come down and stand up and count for her, that we truly believe that she should be given a chance.
Caril gave speeches on the benefits of rehabilitating inmates.
Our program does not deal with why she is there, but what she does while she is there. When she comes into the institution, she has nothing. She hates herself, she hates society, and she wishes she was anywhere but in an institution. Step by step, she progresses through the institution. The more privileges she can assume, the more responsibility she assumes with them. If for any reason a woman cannot handle any of the privileges given her, they can be taken away. In order for total rehabilitation to be successful, the community as a society in general must become involved. It is from the community that the inmate comes, and is back to the community the inmate returns. There is no way the two can be separated and expect a total, complete rehabilitation of the offender.
Caril's lawyer petitioned the Supreme Court for a new trial, but in October 1972 they denied it. That same year, Caril appeared in a documentary called Growing Up in Prison.
I begged him for a lie detector test. I begged him for truth serum. I begged him for anything that would show him that I was telling the truth. And when I went with him, my family was not there in the house. He had already killed him. He threatened me that if I didn't go with him, that my family would be killed. This was the impending thing that made me go. God is my witness. I did not know my family had already been killed. I didn't know this until I came back to Nebraska. These people that he killed, they were good people. I get very emotional when I talk about it because I feel so deeply about it. I'm deeply sorry it happened. There was really no way that I could really stop it. He was a madman. People don't really realize that I lost my family too. When you see girls, their family comes to visit them, their mother and their father, you think, gee, I wished I had a family to visit me. Maybe they do have a fight. Maybe they do have family problems. But at least they have a family. It makes a difference when you know you have people who love you and care about you.
It's something that will always be with me. It's something that I'll always carry with me. I've learned to accept it, and it lives in the back of my mind. It's behind a little door. The past is over with. There's nothing I can do. I can't change it. And I have to make now, today, tomorrow, and my future. There's no way to go back.
I really wish that there was something I could do. I wish there was a magic word I could say or a magic phrase that would bring these people back. I'm sorry. I'm deeply sorry it happened. I swear to Almighty God, I never killed any of them. And I only went because I had no choice.
I was great at being down on myself more than what anybody was down on me. I used to think that I didn't have the right to do a lot of things, even to feel a lot of things. Through counseling, and it was with a minister, I found out two things. One, that I am Caril Fugate. It doesn't leave a bitter taste in my mouth. For years, it used to, I would get real upset if people said my last name, because it was like, somebody throwing mud. It hurt. The other one, I found out that I'm a child of God. No matter what happens, no matter what happened, in the sight of God, it's over. I think these two things, side by side, have helped me come a long way.
In that documentary, Robert Jensen's parents talked about their feelings on Caril and how they felt about her possibly being released.
I don't think there was any doubt about her guilt, and I don't think there was any doubt about her ability to realize right and wrong. In fact, I think probably she was the instigator of most of this. I know that you can be destroyed by hate and bitterness just as well as faith and love can be your salvation.
You would not do anything yourself to prevent her release if they think she's ready to come out, is that?
No, I wouldn't. But if the purpose of it is for rehabilitation, why, half of her lifetime ought to be enough to rehabilitate her.
I don't know how a father can arrive at this point. I mean, where do you get
Well, I'll tell you what, that's what my son would have said. Forgive them, they didn't know what they were doing. He would have, too.
The thing that struck me most about her then and still was her very, very cold eyes, unfeeling look that she would have. I don't think that she has paid for what she did. I don't think she can ever pay for what she did. I think it would be a miscarriage of justice for the ones that were taken for her to be released to have a good life from now on. Their life was taken from them right at the very prime. Well, I definitely am opposed to her release at any time. I think that about sums it up. You've paid a few years and we'll just forget about it all. It was in the past. But you can't forget about it. Bob and Caril are as real to me as if it had happened last night.
In 1973, Caril requested a hearing from the Nebraska Parole Board. The board recommended her case be presented to the State Board of Pardons.
I feel sorry for the people who for 18 years have hated me so bad that it has destroyed their life. It's destroyed their life, and it's made their life more of a prison than mine has been.
In October 1973, the board commuted her life sentence to 30 to 50 years, which made her eligible for parole in 1976.
From the advanced information that I have had on Caril Fugate, and I have followed it with keen interest, I believe that if there's never example of how our system has worked, it's best exemplified in what has been done to rehabilitate Caril Fugate. And I feel quite sure that sometime in the future we can put Caril Fugate back into society where we think that she will have an excellent opportunity to become a valuable working member of our Nebraska community.
In June 1976, shortly before Caril turned 33, she was released on parole after serving 17 and a half years. The attitude in Nebraska was still pretty hostile towards Caril, so she moved to Michigan. She still maintained her innocence. Caril gave several interviews over the years after her release. In 1993, she held a press conference to talk about how her conviction was impacting her life.
I wanted to marry and have children and have a family. But when I seen as time went on, it was impossible. Because this has been a ball and chain around me. I could not subject a child of mine, as she said in Mommy Dearest, why did you adopt me? I never wanted to look at a child and have a child say to me, why did you have me?
In a current affair interview, Caril was asked what would make her happy.
To have one person in Nebraska who always believed, with no doubt, that I was guilty, understand what transpired through this and say to me, I might have been wrong. An entire state was terrified. But my God, he had me in his clutches, and I was not a Bonnie and Clyde having fun as it was depicted. The minute I came into the door, he shoved the gun into my face and had me sit in a rocking chair. And this is when he told me at that time that my family was over at this woman's house, you know, and if I did what I was told, they wouldn't be hurt. All he had to do was make a phone call and they would die. I sat and watched television while he rammed a gun down my sister's throat. And I'm going, what is this? And how do they have the right to put something like this in a book when it's not true? I'm thinking now, he's killed. I know what he's capable of. And I'm going, whoa, you know, I better be very careful and don't cross him. Because if he could bring that gun up in an instant and wipe out this man's life, what could he do to me? He never asked me or ordered me or anything to do on those people, but I don't know if I would have. If it meant, I'm sorry. It is just so painful. I've just started recently able to put their pictures up. It's so hard to look at that little baby and know that she has been suffering. All these people, you know. Oh, God, stop.
Caril took a lie detector test on live television, and it indicated she was telling the truth about being innocent.
Someday, you're going to find out that you made a mistake. And I feel with the help of lie detector that this has been proven.
One of the documentaries I watched on this case was hosted by a very young Maury Povich.
Charlie Starkweather wrought a trail of cold-blooded murder across the West, the likes of which America had never known.
He talked about the lie detector test that Caril took, and I kind of got a kick out of that, because how many times have we heard Maury Povich say, and the lie detector results say? In 2006, Caril married widower Frederick Clare. In August 2013, when Frederick was 80 and Caril 70, they were driving in his car and got in a car accident. Caril was badly injured but survived. Frederick, however, was pronounced dead at the scene. In 2017, Caril requested a pardon to, quote, alleviate the burden of being known as a convicted killer, unquote. But in February 2020, the Nebraska Board of Pardons denied that request. Today, Caril is almost 81 years old and lives in Michigan. She still maintains she is innocent. That's all I have for this case. I am really curious if you think Caril was held hostage, or do you think she took an active role in the crimes? I really don't know how I feel on this one. I think there's evidence that shows Caril did maybe have opportunities to escape if she wanted to. And there is some inconsistency in where she said where she was when the crimes occurred. But at the same time, you have to remember she was 14. She could have easily been influenced by an older boy. And she has maintained her innocence for 60 years. Whether you think she's innocent or guilty, you do have to look at her case as one where it does show the benefit of reform when it comes to prisoners, because she did become a productive member of society. She held jobs. She never committed another crime. So I think it's easy to see that if you take somebody who has had bad behavior and you nourish them and support them, they are able to turn that bad behavior around. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.